Okay, good. So, well, today's Friday, April 27th. So we are on day 5, week 1, day 5. Just continuing on with the federal aviation regulations where you guys left off. Um, as we kind of continue on through this, we're going to cover. You can kind of see the ones that, like I was mentioning, the ones that are boxed in red are the ones we're going to pay more attention to. A lot of these, and you've probably already seen this with Garrett, but a lot of these are repetitive regulations, like where it'll say dispatching authority for flag operations, and it'll say dispatching authority for domestic operations or for supplemental operations. So there's these different types of operations, and there's usually the rules kind of vary between each one. But the ones that we really pay attention to in this course are going to be the ones that are dispatched, like for the domestic operations. That's really the basis of what we're trying to learn in this class. It's important to understand what flag operations and supplemental operations are. You do need to kind of know what they are, but the rules that we pay attention to and the ones specifically that I want you guys to memorize are going to all be dealing with domestic operations. So, so the one you guys left off on last night was 121, and everybody can see it on the screen here, right? 121,595. Everybody see
Yes.
that? Okay, good deal. So that is talking about dispatching authority. So if I scroll up just a little bit here, so if you go up one before that, 121,593, it says dispatching authority for flag operations, or sorry, domestic operations, and then you see one for flag operations. So just let's review the one before that real quick. It says, except when an airplane lands at an intermediate airport specified in the original dispatch release and remains there for not more than 1 hour, no person may start a flight unless an aircraft dispatcher specifically authorizes that flight. So you probably talked about a little bit about this last night, but what it's essentially just saying to us in summary is that in order for a domestically operated flight to occur, an aircraft dispatcher has to authorize that flight. Okay? And when an airplane, let's say an airplane, it gets dispatched by somebody, it takes off, and it goes to, and in this case, in that FAR, it says an intermediate airport. So I don't know how much Garrett went into this last night or not, but did he describe to you guys what an intermediate airport is?
He talked about a pilot, give an example of a pilot going from, I believe, somewhere in Texas, Houston or something like that, to like Seattle, and had to stop over for fuel at Salt Lake. Is that stopover, is that an intermediate airport in this case?
Yeah, it could be. It really just depends on what occurs. So I'll just give it kind of an example to you guys. So I know, hopefully everybody in the class has flown on different airlines before, but like if you take like a Delta Airlines as an example, right? So Delta Airlines has a pretty significant hub operation in Salt Lake City. And what that means, so when we talk about like a hub operation, what that typically means is that flights originate from Salt Lake City. And let's say, like in the case of St. George, St. George has 4 daily flights to and from Salt Lake City on Delta Airlines. What happens is that flight takes off from Salt Lake City as the origin. It lands in St. George, and then it returns to Salt Lake City. Okay, so they call that type of flying hub flying or out and back flying. So the plane basically starts in the hub, it goes to an outstation or a smaller airport, and then it returns back to the hub. It just goes in and out of the hub, usually all day long. Okay, so that's how Delta, United, American, and that's how most of the big airlines function, is through hubs. Now they usually have 5 or 6 major hubs across the United States, and they fly in and out of those hubs all day long. Okay, so that's hub flying, or they call it hub and spoke. And then you have airlines like Southwest Airlines or Frontier Airlines or Spirit, JetBlue, a lot of these other carriers, but Southwest is probably the best example of this. Southwest doesn't have what we just talked about, hub flying, where they go out and back, into a hub, or sorry, out of a hub and then back, to an outstation and then back into a hub. What Southwest does is they have a flight that starts, like you're saying, like in Houston, Texas, and then that flight goes from Houston to, let's say, Dallas, and then it goes from Dallas to Kansas City, and then from Kansas City over to Chicago, and then from Chicago it goes to Cincinnati, and then Cincinnati to Baltimore. But it basically does all of these kind of short hop flights, but it makes its way. It doesn't necessarily return back to the hub airport. It just kind of continues on and crosses the country in some way or fashion. And that type of flying is what we look at when we talk about an intermediate airport. It's that's kind of where this kind of fits in. So an intermediate airport, what it is, it's where an airplane, let's say, like on Southwest as an example, if you wanted to buy a ticket from Dallas going to Chicago, it's going to be the same flight number, except what happens is that, so it kind of, on paper, it looks like the flight goes from Dallas to Chicago, but in reality, the flight stops in Kansas City, it drops passengers off, and then picks up some more, and then it continues on. But a lot of times you don't see that. You just see this direct flight number that just shows going Dallas to Chicago. And what happens is the people that are going from Dallas to Chicago, they get on the plane, it takes off, and then it lands in Kansas City. And the people that weren't going to Kansas City just simply stay on the plane. And then the ones that were getting off, get off. The ones that were continuing on don't even get off the plane. But then it adds more people on, and then those people, along with the original people, continue on to Chicago. And then same deal happens there. Some people get off. Some people stay on, but an intermediate airport is basically, the true definition is where a plane lands and some passengers get off and some stay on, and then the flight then continues on. So if you go back to that hub and spoke model that I was just talking about, so like if a plane goes from Salt Lake City to St. George, once it gets to St. George, every single passenger is going to get off the plane, right? Because obviously there wouldn't be anybody staying on the plane just to return to Salt Lake City where they just came from. So in order to qualify as an intermediate airport, the plane has to have, like, all of the passengers cannot deplane. Some have to stay on and some have to get off. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Just kind of wanted to differentiate between what, like, a destination and an intermediate airport is. So anytime you have, if every passenger were to get off the plane, then it doesn't count as an intermediate airport. In order to qualify, it means that some of the passengers have to stay on the plane and some have to, get off and some stay on. But anyway, what that rule is telling us is that if the airplane, so as a dispatcher, and the reason why we care about this is that if you're the dispatcher and you're sending this flight from Dallas to Chicago with a stopover in Kansas City along the way, you can send that flight, as one dispatch release. It's a flight being dispatched from Dallas to Chicago with an intermediate stop at Kansas City. And they don't, once they get to Kansas City, they don't have to get a new dispatch release. they can, as long as they don't stay on the ground for over an hour, they can continue flying that flight and take back off again without getting a new dispatch release or in this case, a new authorization, as the FAR reads in there. Okay, if it was not an intermediate airport and every passenger got off in Kansas City, then regardless of whether it's on the flight or on the ground for less than an hour, a dispatcher would have to reauthorize that flight because it doesn't count as an intermediate stop. So does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Good deal. So if anybody ever asks you what is an intermediate airport, a lot of times people will try and trick you and say, oh, well, like going back to the Salt Lake St. George model, which is the hub and spoke model, a lot of times people will try and say, oh, well, if I'm going Salt Lake to St. George and then St. George to Salt Lake, they try and count St. George as an intermediate airport. And sometimes there are some companies, like the very first company I ever worked for as a dispatcher was Great Lakes Airlines in Wyoming. And they used to dispatch their planes just like that. I would send a flight from Denver to Rapid City, South Dakota. And then the next flight would be Rapid City back to Denver. Okay, except they taught me, and I later learned that this was not correct, but they taught me that I could just send that flight as one flight release. It would just be one flight, Denver to Rapid City, and then Rapid City back to Denver, all on the same release, and try to make it look like Rapid City was an intermediate airport. But the problem is that when every single passenger gets off in Rapid City, that makes it not count as an intermediate airport. And it's technically not the proper way to dispatch. So anyway, I learned later on in my career that an intermediate airport means that some of the passengers do have to stay on the plane. And that's kind of the model that other airlines use. So just kind of, some back pocket knowledge for you later on in case that ever comes up. And it's kind of rare now. Most flights with any airline, almost every flight is done by a dispatcher, regardless of whether it's an intermediate stop or not. So, okay, so the next one, when it talks about dispatching authority for flag operations, it's basically saying the same thing. It says no person may start a flight unless an aircraft dispatcher specifically authorizes that flight. No person may continue a flight from an intermediate airport without redispatch if the airplane has been on the ground for more than 6 hours. Now, the difference between flag and domestic is really international, and flag basically is international. And so when you're talking about flag operations, it's basically it's the same rule. It's just giving us more time. It's actually giving them 6 hours. That if they stopped at an intermediate airport, they then have a 6-hour window to where they would be able to take back off again without getting a new dispatch release. Okay, so that's the difference between those two. And then 597 is the authority, and I don't have this one in red because it's for supplemental operations. But it kind of has the same rules. It kind of has a mixture of them, but it's basically telling us that it has the 6-hour rule as well. So, but that's not one that you guys really need to know about there. So we're going to continue on and look at 121.599, familiarity with weather conditions. Okay, this is one that you want to know. It's in red here. It says domestic and flag operations. No aircraft dispatcher may release a flight unless he is thoroughly familiar with reported and forecasted weather conditions on the route to be flown. Does anyone have any? I mean, this one's pretty straightforward. Does everyone understand why this is a rule?
Yep.
Does it make sense that as a dispatcher, before you go sending a flight, that you need to know about the weather that they're going to potentially be flying through on the route that you're choosing for them to fly? Yeah, obviously that makes sense, right? Pretty straightforward. you can't go dispatching flights unless you have taken a look at the weather, studied it, and make sure that it can be conducted safely. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Just remember that you need to know that, though. Obviously, you need to know that um, you need to be thoroughly familiar, and you need to do all your homework and take a look. You can't just go pushing buttons and sending flights wherever you want without taking a look and really studying the weather. So just need to be thoroughly familiar with reported and forecast weather conditions on every route of every plane that you dispatch. So that's something you're going to do with every single plane.
Adam, what's the standard like forecasted weather conditions? If, for example, I've got a flight that's supposed to depart in 2 hours and continues to get delayed for weather, and how far out am I forecasting?
Well, so when you just normally as a dispatcher, you have all these flights that you're sending. So let's just go back to where it's not even delayed at all, right? Let's just say that the flight is on time and just what the normal operation is. So if I'm a dispatcher and I've got a flight coming up and it's on time and everything else is normal, you typically are going to start taking a look at this flight and the weather and all of the the discrepancies with maintenance or anything else with this plane. You're going to start looking at all of this stuff and do all of your planning process or start your planning process anywhere from 90 minutes to 2 hours before the flight is scheduled to depart, right? So that's just the normal operation. Now, at that point, you take a look at the weather, you see, okay, well, this flight is from Denver to San Diego, right? Let's just call it a 2.5 hour flight. So you start taking a look at the weather forecast for San Diego. At that point, you're looking like 4 or 5 hours down the road because, at that point, you're 2 hours before it even departs. And then when it departs, you still got 2.5 hours of it flying, right? So you start looking at weather, depending on how long the flight is, you're looking at weather sometimes 6, 7 hours down the road, especially if it's a really long flight. But you do it like the weather for your origin, obviously at that point you're 90 minutes to 2 hours out. But if it starts getting delayed and things like that, what typically happens with a dispatcher and delays is that a dispatcher really doesn't care about a flight unless it's supposed to depart. Like I say, once it gets within this 90-minute window to 2 hour window, a dispatcher will start caring about it. Now, like I said, if it's a situation where it's on time, then there's nothing, the dispatcher will just expect and assume that the flight's going to leave on time unless otherwise told by somebody else. Like there's different positions in the OCC that are more responsible for that kind of stuff, that delay flights out due to ATC, flow delay programs, or maintenance reasons or anything like that. But just as a general rule, dispatchers don't care about delays. They care about them only from the standpoint of they just want to know when they need to start planning the flight. But let's say I start taking a look at a flight and it's supposed to be on time, but then somebody calls me up and says, "Hey Adam, you've got this flight. It's actually got a 2 hour ATC flow delay on it, so I'm going to go ahead and push that out another 2 hours." I'm like, okay, great. So all I do at that point is I just take that flight and I move it 2 hours down my list. And so that it doesn't even come into my field of view until it gets back within that 90-minute to 2 hour window. Now, let's say if it got delayed out, and then I moved it down out of my view, but then let's say for whatever reason, maybe it got undelayed. Let's say that, the ATC delays got better and they were able to remove some of the delay. Well, in that case, the same person that originally called me to tell me it was delayed is also responsible for calling me and telling me that it's now undelayed. So that in that case, you would also get another phone call saying, "Hey, Adam, this flight, I told you that I was going to push it out 2 hours. Well, now we found out it's only going to be 45 minutes delayed, so I'm going to bring it back up. And then that basically signals to me to move it back into my list. But all I'm doing at that point with any flight, and that it doesn't matter whether it's ATC, weather, or maintenance, or any other type of delay that you could have, you just are simply, as a dispatcher, you're just moving these flights around to the estimated time of departure and then putting them within like a 2-hour window of that time so that you know when to start planning them. Now, a lot of times we get all the way through planning a flight, sending the release, and then find out it's delayed after the fact. Well, kind of the same thing, even though you've already sent a release or whatever, and then it gets delayed after or it goes on maintenance, you still kind of do the same process. You just simply take the flight, you move it down to wherever you want it, time-wise to where it's estimated that it'll either be fixed or estimated for its ATC delay or weather delay or whatever other reason, and you just simply put it back into that window. If it needs a new dispatch release at the time that it comes back up, then you may have to redo all of your planning and stuff again. But all I'm really trying to say is that it's the same process over and over for every single flight. Even if you've already sent a release and it got delayed, and then it got back to now where it's time for it to go again after the delay, even if you've already sent the release, you're going to go back and re-review the release to make sure with all the new weather and all of the new parameters that it's still good to go as you originally planned it, or if you need to make changes. So it's relatively the same process, but maybe a little bit of extra work depending on, how many times you have to send the release depending on the delays. I don't know if does that answer the question, or did I just?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So yeah, but generally speaking though, the only time a dispatcher even cares about a flight is if it's going to operate, right? And if it's going to, it basically once it's getting within that window of operation. So if flights are getting canceled, then like I said, the dispatcher doesn't care about any of that stuff. The dispatcher's only concern is the flight going to operate? Okay, and if so, what time? If it's delayed, if it's on time, if it's whatever. They don't care about maintenance. They don't care about any of that stuff. They just want to know that the release is good for whenever it's supposed to depart. So let's see here. So moving down, 121.601, aircraft dispatcher information to the pilot in command for domestic and flag operations. This one says that the aircraft dispatcher shall provide the pilot in command all available current reports or information on airport conditions and irregularities of navigation facilities that may affect the safety of flight. Before beginning a flight, the aircraft dispatcher shall provide the pilot in command with all available weather reports and forecasts of weather phenomena that may affect the safety of flight, including adverse weather phenomena such as clear air turbulence, thunderstorms, and low altitude wind shear for each route to be flown and each airport to be used. During a flight, the aircraft dispatcher shall provide the pilot in command any additional available information of meteorological conditions, including adverse weather phenomena, same thing, clear air turbulence, thunderstorms, low altitude wind shear, and irregularities of facilities and services that may affect the safety of flight. So what this is telling us, and it's in red, it's one that you need to know, but what it's telling us is that the dispatcher is responsible for providing the pilot all of the current information for the flight, and particularly, weather reports, navigation facilities, like, with our navigation facilities, a lot of times we have satellite coverage that is spotty and that can affect our satellite navigation. Sometimes we have, and like it's talking about weather, if there's thunderstorms along the route that your flight is flying, turbulence, wind shear, any of that kind of stuff, the dispatcher is responsible for passing all of that information along to the pilot in command. So you kind of look at this in a couple of different ways. as the aircraft dispatcher is planning a flight, he obviously takes all of the current information at that point and uses it to plan the flight and makes sure that he can send that flight safely based on the current information. Okay, so everything's good to go. He sends out the release, and then so now we're kind of, so that first part we're talking about the planning process before the release is sent. Okay, now let's fast forward and say, okay, dispatcher sent the release, but you're kind of in that window of where you sent the release, but the plane hasn't left yet. Like it's still, the plane is still at the gate. It hasn't, it's maybe starting to board or whatever. It's getting ready to go. So the dispatcher, even still during that time, is still responsible to go back and recheck that information. Even though the release has already been sent, the dispatcher is still responsible for updating the pilots if anything has changed, and it goes back and it lists those same things. Anything that affects the safety of flight, any adverse weather phenomena, such as the ones we already talked about, the turbulence, the thunderstorms, low altitude wind shear. Same thing with the satellite navigation or any type of navigation that you're using on that flight. And then, so it's basically from start to finish, this is telling us that it's the dispatcher's responsibility in the planning stage, in the stage that's in between the release but before beginning the flight. Okay, and then the next one in paragraph C, it's saying during the flight. Once the flight gets out, takes off, gets in the air, it's still the dispatcher's responsibility for watching the changes in the weather and anything that affects the safety of flight.
Sorry, just to go back to B,
Uh-huh.
before beginning a flight, is that just to notify the pilot of any changes to what's on the existing release as far as forecasts?
Correct, yeah. And it's not that he has to go back and change the release. It's just that the dispatcher, if anything is dramatically different in between, once the dispatcher has sent the release and before the plane pushes back, yeah, if anything changes, drastically changes, that's not already on the release, then it's the dispatcher's responsibility to notify the captain and let him know, like, hey, the forecast now is telling us that it's going to be a lot worse or better or whatever, or hey, there's a big thunderstorm that popped up along the route where I planned you. But let's say originally when I planned you, it didn't look like there was going to be thunderstorms in that area. But now, fast forward, that was an hour ago, and I guessed wrong, and there actually is a thunderstorm there. So maybe I want you to add a little bit more gas than I planned before you leave. Add on some extra gas so that if we need to, we can route around that thunderstorm in that area. Little things like that. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so that's the dispatcher's responsibility to always keep the crew updated to those kind of things. Now, the reason why it breaks it down, like obviously there's the pre-planning process, the pre-sending the release process that you're doing. Okay, now it's talking about the in between the release being sent and before the plane actually leaving. So that stage is really important because you've sent the release, right, with all of the parameters that you wanted that flight to use to conduct the flight safely. So all of that information is on the release. But if something changes, you still have time to either, one, take additional measures like adding fuel or changing the route or doing whatever you need to do to continue to make sure that the flight can operate safely. But being able to get that information to the crew before they actually leave is important, because, you can't add fuel in the air. It's really hard to add fuel even after pushback. Like if they have left the gate, to get them and still haven't taken off, it's hard to get, especially in the big hub airports, it's hard to get them to do a U-turn and head back to the gate for fuel. And it's very time consuming. And especially in today's environment where, we're really tight on crew times and their availability of how much they can fly each day, every minute becomes extremely precious. So you don't want to do anything that, and sometimes you can't avoid that, but to the extent that a dispatcher can, you always want to try and be vigilant with all of your flights. When you're doing the release, you want to plan it as perfectly as you can based on the information that you have at that time. Okay, but it comes to a point where you got to send the release. Okay, once it gets within 60 minutes and that release hasn't been sent, you're going to start getting a lot of phone calls. So that, in order for everybody else in the process to start being able to do their job, they need a flight release. They need a dispatch release. And all of the information for how the flight's going to be conducted, if you think about it, there's an army of people waiting at the airport for this little document called the dispatch release to show up on their printer. Okay? Because they can't do a thing until that release shows up. Now, Elizabeth, you're probably a good one to talk to about that specific thing. Is that not the case of how this works pretty much exactly? You guys are waiting for that release, right?
In Flagstaff, we have Sabre, and we would enter in the keystrokes like repeatedly until the dispatch release populated, because we have wind, we have high elevation, we de-ice planes, and then in the summer we have heat in Flagstaff and Phoenix, which is where all of our flights were going to. And then we just had favorite pilots too. So we were always looking at the release to see who was coming in and how many people we could get out.
Yep. So tell me this.
Adam, with that being said, like in a day-to-day operation, what's the feasibility of us having multiple flights that are leaving around the same bank, around the same window?
You definitely will. Let me jump into that here in just a second so I can describe it a little bit better. But going back to Elizabeth real quick. So Elizabeth, at what point do you start panicking? If the release hasn't arrived and calculated by X amount of time, what is that time frame? That if it's not there by how many minutes before the flight's supposed to, do you start making phone calls to the dispatch center?
Flagstaff, depending on the season, will call at 60 minutes.
Okay.
Which is how I got to know so many of the dispatchers, because they'd say, yep, working on it right now, just give me 2 minutes. And then I would wait 5 and call again.
Yep.
Because when we would be weight restricted, we had to start offering passengers money to not fly, which is never easy. And in some cases, we would have to hire cabs and pay for people to be driven 2 hours to Phoenix to catch their flight.
Exactly.
So we'd be calling as soon as we could, and we had a pretty good rapport with the dispatchers who would call us 2 hours ahead of time and say, we know we're going to at least take 40 out of 50 people. So then we could start working on asking for 10 volunteers.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, it comes up against, you kind of come up against, you're getting up against the clock. And she says 60 minutes, and that's for an outstation like Flagstaff, where it's more than likely that's the only flight that you're probably dealing with, right? And so if you can think about that in terms of a hub like Phoenix or Salt Lake City, if you don't have the releases out and ready to go, in those cases, they've got 100 flights that they need to go at the same time. So going back to Ash's question and talking about, you have multiple flights that are all going out, right? So let's go back to that hub and spoke model for just a minute, because in the hub and spoke model, all of the planes, so like if you have Salt Lake City as an example, and, going back to, let's say, Delta Airlines, Salt Lake City, they have all of these flights that leave Salt Lake City, and they go to all of these cities, all the cities in Montana, Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, all around the western United States, right? And these, passengers fly into Salt Lake City from a different origin, and then they connect and get on a flight going out of Salt Lake City. But all of these flights in the hub and spoke model, they all leave the airport usually within, and it can be 150 flights, and they're all going to leave within usually 60 to 70 minutes of each other, right? And they're timed so that people can come in and connect and then go on to their next flight and not have to stay in the airport for several hours waiting for a connecting flight. So they're built and they're timed to be as efficient as possible. But the problem with that model is that anytime you get any type of a disruption, such as weather, air traffic control delays, maintenance, but the biggest ones in the hub and spoke model that affect us negatively are weather issues. So if you get a big thunderstorm over Salt Lake City and all of these flights that are coming inbound, so the problem is they all leave at the same time, but then they all come back at the same time. So if you ever go into a major hub airport, depending on when you walk into that airport, it's either going to be jam-packed with people or it's going to look like a ghost town. There's really nothing in between. It's either packed or it's dead. And that's because, all the flights come in, all the passengers deplane, they all run through the airport and run to their connecting flights, and then they all leave. And then that space in between where they've left and then waiting for them to come back, those same planes, because all they do is they go out to the outstations and then they return to the hub. They drop off people and then they bring other people back. And they do the same process. Those people, they bring them back in and then they connect to other flights, and they repeat that process 5 or 6 times throughout the day. And they call those banks. So you have a morning bank, you have a mid-morning bank, you have a noon bank, an afternoon bank, evening bank, and a late evening red-eye bank. So that's typically how hub airports work. And if if a thunderstorm moves over the field while all of these planes are on their way back to the hub, then you end up with what we call a mass diversion scenario. And if it comes down to the point where the thunderstorm is so bad that people can't get in and land at the airport, if it's right over the field, you can get hundreds of diversions. And if that weather event happens right after the planes had just left the airport, then it might not have any effect at all. So it really is just all about timing. But going back to her question, because of the hub and spoke model, a dispatcher dispatching flights will always have, it kind of goes in the same fashion. It's like you're going to have 5 or 6 planes that are all probably leaving within 20 to 30 minutes of each other all at the same time. And the only difference there is that you're not usually going to have a whole bunch of flights that are leaving from the same airport at the same time. You're usually going to have, okay, I have one leaving Salt Lake, I got one leaving in Denver, I got one leaving Chicago. So you might not have to deal with it, but you'll usually always still have several flights, leaving or landing within minutes of each other. So, so that's kind of how that process works. But you got to think of it as the dispatcher's the first person. He's the one that authorizes the flight. So nobody can do a dang thing until the dispatcher prepares the release and sends it out. So everybody's kind of waiting on the dispatcher, and it's really hard for the dispatcher to understand how much behind the scenes work is waiting on the dispatcher. Like we were saying, like there's an army of people just sitting back waiting for that little document to come up on their screen or print out on their printer, so that, like Elizabeth was saying, if they need to start asking passengers to take a later flight, offering compensation, getting cabs set up, hotels set up, you can only imagine, like when a flight gets canceled or a maintenance delay and how many people miss connections because of a maintenance delay in Flagstaff or wherever. It's a never-ending nightmare from a customer service standpoint. So this is a business. The one thing you got to remember about your job is that there's a fine line between your job responsibilities and your responsibility to your company that you work for from a profitability and a business operation standpoint. You obviously want your employer to do well because it means you do well, right? And so one thing that we talk about a lot in this field, and whether it's a pilot or a dispatcher, we talk about this thing called operational control, right? And did you guys go over what operational control is?
Yeah,
yes,
we did.
but refresh our memory.
Okay. Well, we will, and you're going to hear it a lot over the next several weeks. But operational control is the authority to initiate, conduct, or terminate a flight. Okay, and specifically in our terms, a Part 121 passenger operated flight. So there's only two people that have operational control over any given flight. That is the pilot in command and the aircraft dispatcher. Those are the only two people that have any say, any authority over the operation of a flight. Not even the first officer, even though he's sitting there on the right side of the captain. He's just really kind of more of his helper. He has no operational control, though. He has no authority over that flight. It's only the dispatcher and the pilot in command. And why is it important to know that? It's because you play two totally different roles, the dispatcher and the pilot in command, but your primary objective is the same. You and the pilot in command are responsible for the safe operation of that aircraft. And the reason why the FAA makes dispatchers go and get a license in order to do this job, why you actually have to go through this course and become individually licensed through the FAA in order to do this job, is because it is expected, and it's the same thing with the pilot in command and his license as well. It's the same thing. But the reason you have to go get this license is because your primary responsibility is the safe operation of your flights, of any flight that you dispatch. That is your primary objective. Anything outside of that, anything that interferes with safety, you can override any company policy, any company initiative, anything that you want in the nature of a safe operation. So you have this license in your pocket, and you have the ability to make any decision you want as a dispatcher in the means of having a flight conduct a safe operation. Okay, so the reason why I'm kind of harping on this a little bit is because as a dispatcher, you have two different forces that are kind of pulling against you. Okay, this license that you have in your pocket is your responsibility to the passenger, okay, and your responsibility to the FAA. The reason why an airline can't just go hire somebody off the street and train them as a dispatcher, and without a license, and just say, hey, I'm SkyWest Airlines, I'm just going to go hire some people, I'm going to train them how to dispatch our SkyWest flights, and then we're going to authorize them to do that. You can kind of see that there's a big conflict of interest there in this position of dispatcher. And the same thing with the pilot in command. There's a big conflict of interest, and the reason, because of this conflict of interest, is why the FAA makes you go and get your own individual license that has nothing to do with the airline you work for. That certificate, license that you have at the end of this course is yours to take it, and never, you take it with you for the rest of your life. It's yours regardless of where you work. And that's basically saying that you are an authorized person to dispatch flights for any airline that wants to hire you to do so. But your primary responsibility as a licensed dispatcher is to your license and to the safety of the flying public. Okay? Now, there's that side of it, right? That's your primary responsibility. That's what you always have to lean on first. Okay? But as long as everything else is safe and everything else is going good, well, then your next primary objective and your next responsibility is to your company that you work for. Okay, so any company initiative, any profitability measurement that they want to press onto you or try and have you focus on. Everything like that is perfectly fine as long as it doesn't interfere with safety, which is your primary objective. So you kind of have these different forces against you, and you'll see it when you dispatch. But sometimes company initiatives interfere with the decision making of a dispatcher, right? So, and it doesn't help when you have an army of people sitting back waiting for you to prepare this big dispatch release. And let's say it's a bad day. Let's say that there's a lot of thunderstorms around or this and that. You don't know. It's not. Let's say it's a day where it's the type of day where you got to spend a lot of time on your dispatch releases due to weather or whatever scenario in order to assure that they can be conducted safely. Okay, well, a lot of people outside of the dispatch office, they don't understand this, right? The weather in Flagstaff might be great, right? It might be a great day in Flagstaff, but this flight is going to San Francisco, let's say. Usually the people at one airport usually aren't looking at another airport. And so they don't always have the big picture. And so sometimes when a flight starts getting delayed, they don't understand why, and so, and obviously they want explanations, and you're going to start getting phone calls, and you're going to have a lot of these influences that start, that'll interrupt your work, and because you got to start answering questions and things like that start coming along. And you have to explain, hey, well, because of this scenario, the flight's going to be delayed 2 hours, but you also have to remember that the reason you have a job is because of the company, right? So you have responsibilities to both parties there, but your primary responsibility is the safe operation of your flights and dispatching them safely. So if anything ever happened that was deemed to be unsafe, the FAA doesn't go after the company. They go to the dispatcher and to the pilot in command, because that's where the buck stops, if that makes sense. Let's see here.
Okay. Sorry, guys. I know we're grooving. He doesn't.
That's fine.
He really wants to go out. I'm just going to, if you guys want to keep going, I'm just going to step outside for like 5-10 minutes.
Oh, no, you're fine. We can take a break.
Keep going or take a break. Either way, I can dive right back in. So.
No, we're good. We're at a good point for a break. So let's take 10 and be back on at 6:50. Let's just say 6:51.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.